The rain came down like a secret being worked into the earth, sharp, insistent, as if the Serra itself had decided to punish those who rode beneath its spine. Lightning stitched the sky into white veins, and the thunder answered with a low, hungry drum. Isabela Vasconcelos rode hard because she was proud, because her pride had been taught to her in linens and lessons, in the careful ways her father would correct a tilt of the chin, in the soft refusals that had trained her limbs to hold position, even when the world tilted. Libertad, her mare, moved with the same measured fury, hooves beating the glistening track, mane plastered with rain, nostrils bright and wide. She should have turned back when the first fat drops began to try the air. Colonel Augusto would have told her so. Women did not ride in storms, much less alone. But pride is a lantern you carry until wind finds it. Isabella urged her mount faster, thinking of the library she had left half read, of the cool silvered ink of the room awaiting her at home, of the absurd certainty that rituals could hold even storm-scraped nights at bay. Then Libertad's hind leg slipped. A jag of rock, unkind and sudden, bit at the horse's balance. The world lost the geometry she had trusted. Isabella felt the saddle vanish under her, as if someone had plucked a string, the mare's panicked breath in her ear, and then she was down. Thrown over damp stone, the world tilting into a rush of cold and salt, and the small, shocked sound of her own body. She was menaced by rain so entirely that colour dissolved into the blind sheet. Her silk dress, once smooth and proud, clung to her skin in sodden, humiliating folds. The fall had been quick enough to split her lip and bruise her shoulder. The river of cold coursed through the fabric and into her. She tasted iron and thunder. Her limbs began to go traitorous, fingers numb, breath thick and slow as if the storm itself pressed against her ribs. She did not know the Serra gave no quarter until it was almost too late. They found her because the plantation would not let the world hold such a thing unattended. A shout cut through the thunder, sharp, tight, and then more feet and the slap of boots on wet earth. Dante moved like a man who had been formed by hard labor and by rules that insisted he be seen, but not counted. He called as he ran, voice deeper than the storm's shriek. Isabella! The name had the clipped respect of a man who gave it without claiming it. He reached her with a bundle of men around him. Behind Dante, the other workers, brown hands and shorn faces, took shape in the wrong light. For them the storm was weather, not drama. Dante was not a man of the house in any respectable record. He was, by the brittle law of their world, a slave of the Vasconcelos estate. Eyes that held a longitude of patient fury, hands cut by years of rope and plough, shoulders that knew the weight of both burden and command. He had the odd station of a skilled man. He could shoe a horse that no hired farrier could ever shoe as well, could read a well in drought, coax a balky mill, give orders the others took without question. The colonel tolerated him, as one tolerates a tool that will not relinquish its usefulness. That tolerance was a thin crust above a deep river of ownership. Dante's life still belonged to the ledger on the colonel's desk. Everyone on the plantation lived under that ledger, even those who would later insist they did not. Dante knelt by Isabella without letting an edge of deference or of touch that would confuse the night. He took in the cut of her lip, the glaze of rain in her lashes, the way her hands were beginning to curl against the cold. His gaze flicked quickly to the dress, to how it clung like a second skin, and his face, so often kept under iron, unlocked for a fraction into a look of practitioner's focus. "Lie still," he said. No softness, no sweetness, just the directness of a man who had learned to move a body to save it. The rain rattled overhead. The men, those who were permitted to be near, shifted in the dark, a low murmur of concern and the practical clack of someone who knew the signals of danger. Isabella could not gather sound well. The world narrowed around the ringing in her head, and a cold that felt doctrinal. Her mind jabbed at propriety like a trapped bird. "Dante," she began, voice an offended feather. The very notion of being in such a state was a violence to everything she had been taught. The thought of being stripped by him, by one who was legally beneath her, was an affront to the patterns that had governed her life. Dante did not flinch from the hesitation in her voice. "You are wet through," he said, steady as a plumb line. "Wet clothes take the heat out of the body. It's why people die of cold even when the air is not colder than a proper winter. You must get out of that dress. She pictured father's eyes. She pictured the small, sharp conversation in drawing-room light where the colonel had once corrected her manner. She pictured the whispering lane of rumour that would form like a stitch in the neck of the house. She clutched at the silk as if it were the last proof she had of place. "I will not," she tried. Dante's jaw tightened. He reached for her hand and pressed the warmth of his palm to her knuckles, surprising her with its heat. "If you refuse, you will die," he said, and the sentence had no room for social niceties because it carried a reality. Wetness steals heat. The body cannot fight a bath of rain forever. You will be gone before morning. That is not a future the house should bury like a hush. She thought, sudden, horrified of being carried in face down to the manor with the servants' faces all turned away. She thought of a funeral that would be a lesson instead of a lament. Pride, for a moment, did a strange thing. It did not keep her safe. It only promised a finer angle on disgrace. Someone, an older worker with eyes like coffee, was holding a blanket. The men made a small shelter of tarpaulin, their bodies forming a crude wall against the rain. The smell of wet rope and leather rose around them like a catechism. Dante worked without hesitation. He cut her laces where they would not wound her, loosened the bindings at her waist. The dress was more than clothing now. It was an armor that had been turned traitor, and Isabella's face went pale as the underside of a leaf. The fabric slid and clung and finally surrendered, pooling about her like a second downpour. She had never felt so exposed, but she also had never felt her heat go so quickly, like a lamp whose oil had been spilled. Light stars pricked at the edge of her vision. Her breaths came in fragile little ships. Dante wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, but physical warmth was not enough. The man's hands moved with the decisiveness of someone who saw the body as a problem to be fixed. He stripped a spare shirt from himself, a simple, coarse thing, and pried at the collar of her chemise to get air to the chest where it mattered most. His fingers were quick, experienced, and careful. Where she expected to be handled like a commodity, she found touch that recognized the threshold between help and violation. He leaned his own body against hers, pressing heat like an argument into the cold. "Press close," he told her, voice low but urgent. "We will warm you against me and then to a fire. You must not let the cold take all of you." The nearness of him was a breach. He was a man who had been ordered and punished and sold, who slept under sky and answered the land with the back he kept almost defiantly strong. Hands that mended fences now mended the thin seams of a woman's life that had been rent by weather. To be against Dante was to know the terrible, unprivileged reality that proximity did not equal consent. Isabella obeyed because terror and instinct are more honest than propriety. She pressed her shivering body into him, and heat moved like a slow current. Breath met breath. Rain hammered. The men around them murmured, finally practical, finally private. Dante's shoulder was a stone. His ribs rose and fell with the safari rhythm of a man used to controlling his body against strain. She felt the steadiness and the smell of smoke that had already been in his hair from past stints at the hearth. The salt and iron of the rain in her own mouth dulled into something that was not yet shame, but might become it if morning broke in the wrong light. "Stay with me as long as you can," Dante murmured, and there was no shame in the request, only urgency. "If the colonel comes, if they come, tell them you were with the workers. Say I found you. Say anything but that you were alone." The rules were always there, layered and merciless. His life, if discovered in such a compromising closeness to the mistress, would be in immediate peril, not because the colonel would feel only personal dishonor, but because the ledger that kept people like Dante in their place allowed punishments like sale or worse when lines of propriety were crossed. She stared at him, at the dark tilt of his mouth, the quick, almost impatient way his fingers worked at her sleeve, and the words mingled in her chest with a fear that felt absurd in its clarity. "Will you be punished?" she whispered. Pride had loosened, but not vanished. It lodged like a stone in her throat. Dante's face went small, a boat with a candle inside. "Every day I wake to the touch of that ledger," he said. "But tonight you live, because if you die, there will be questions the house cannot tolerate. Do not thank me. Save the thanks." He kept her warm until the shiver loosened from her limbs. He coaxed her to the fire the men had coaxed together, a thin, stubborn thing that popped up blue and obedient and smelled like wet wood and hope. They dried her hair with rough towels, tamped the damp into being less a presence and more a memory, and the group fell into a careful choreography. The men who could be visible tended the flames, while the rest stayed in the periphery. It was a ritual they had performed maybe a dozen times before, in varying degrees of catastrophe. When she was more steady, when blood found its way back into her cheeks and the edge in her breath lessened, Isabela sat up and watched Dante as if from an unfamiliar shore. He looked like a man who had been asked to do too much and who had done it regardless. He bore no airs, no excuse. The damp clung to him in a way that declared the night had touched him as well. "He saved you." Her voice was thin. For a sliver of time she forgot the ledger, forgot the rules. There was only the simple fact: without Dante, she would be gone. "You owed nothing to save me," she said, finally finding the thread of propriety. Gratitude in the house was always a complicated garment. Dante shrugged. "I owed the work, I owed the land, I owed the horse, and I do not want to bury the mistress, because tomorrow the colonel will be without an heir to scold while he sits by his tobacco." His voice carried black humor, but not without a softness that made the set of his mouth unreadable. There was a pause, the kind that tries to decide whether to become conversation or confession. The fire made the men into silhouettes like one could imagine in scripture, compressed, practical, necessary. Rain hammered, lightning flared a cold white. Then Dante said something in a voice like a snapped thread. "Take off your wet dress." The sentence came like a bell. It was not the gentle entreaty she might have expected in the house. It was an imperative, a command of necessity. For a moment, the world condensed to the syllables. Someone might later market that sentence into scandal, an order from a slave to a mistress, but in the cavern of the night it was strictly a medical instruction. "Take off your wet dress," he repeated louder now, because the storm found ways to drown good intentions. The words were like flint. They were not cruel. They were essential. They were the terse language of someone who has watched people die for lack of such sentences in the past. If pride was offense, that command was an axe. If you love storm-born love stories, stay with us. She swallowed around a dry, terrible feeling, and then she did something neither father nor etiquette had taught her. She obeyed. There was a kind of intimate cruelty in being stripped in the company of men whose lives were not permitted the same sympathies that were allowed to the genteel. Hands that had forced palms to plough and skin to blister now smoothed a shivering shoulder. There was a softness in the way Dante turned away momentarily, a habit of propriety that existed even among those who had no official right to claim it. He did what had to be done and kept himself a margin of respect. He gave her choice within the narrow corridor of necessity. When she permitted him to help her out of the remaining garments, the air felt like an accusation. The silk fell away and her body, which had been wrapped in the armor of status, lay bare to the world. The cold struck with an animal intelligence. Dante wrapped her again, but this time closer, until breath mingled with breath in a heat that felt both sacrament and transgression. He pressed his hands to places where ropes had once marked someone as a thing to be moved, and in that pressure there was a gentleness that refused to be reduced to ownership. Something else moved between them then, after the practical triage, after the immediate panic had loosened its grip. Isabela felt the uneven maps of her world redraw. A shame she had been taught, fine, elegant, absolute, began to fray, giving way to a hunger for bodily warmth and for the human voice that had not been filtered through the house's etiquette. The nearness of Dante was a geography she had not been permitted to traverse. The more she crossed, the more she understood how treacherous the terrain was. Dante was careful at first. His hands were educated by labor and by an understanding that the world was watching. Yet the atmosphere cracked. At the firelight his face looked softer, and his gaze lingered in the kind of way that meant recognition. No longer slave and mistress, but two bleeding, living beings. "You took a risk," she said later, finding that she could speak without the stiff syllables of the drawing-room. He did not answer with a flourish. Instead, he admitted, "A man's life is made up of many risks. Some are measured by the ledger, some by the land. Tonight, I chose a different measure. She had to stay awake, she told herself, because sleep seemed to promise the end of something she would not yet name. In that sleepless hour, lying propped against him with the blanket over both of them, she felt the walls of her life rearrange. The rules that had long governed her, dress, posture, the way her elbow should or should not rest, were suddenly ridiculous when held up to the night. Hunger pressed in other directions, for warmth, for the rough presence of another person who would not recite the house's expectations in the dark. When Dante finally angled his face down to hers, it was not a command, but an inquiry. His eyes held an honesty that the Colonel's drawing room did not allow. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. Her answer was an embarrassed, foolish laugh. "For me, that I belong in the house, maybe with a bruise to tell a story." The absurdity of protecting reputation when she had nearly died made her voice thin with the sudden awareness of mortality. Dante's jaw flexed. "For me, it means the ledger will not leave me untouched. You should know that. People will ask questions. The Colonel, your father, he has standards. He will demand an accounting." She had always imagined those standards as gilded gates, heavy with the weight of old names. Now she saw that they could swing like a blade. "What can we do?" she asked, because the most dangerous part of pride is that it sometimes keeps a person from asking for what they need. "What choice do we have?" He looked at her then in a way that was not the firelight, but something colder and more practical. "I can take you back," he said. "I will say I found you on the track and brought you in. I will tell them you were with the workers. I will keep to the facts as I can. But the ledger will not be satisfied by facts alone. You know that." She did know. The house liked narratives, not truth. It liked tidy explanations with heroes and villains that rested the conscience. "There's another way," Dante said quietly, and the phrase carried with it the weight of a man who had thought and planned in the small hours. "If you keep to the narrative that you were with the workers, it will be enough for a while. But if whatever was here is found, they may punish me. I could be sold, I could be whipped. You know the ledger." His words unreeled pictures she had been studiously blind to. Men bound and driven at auction, darers flung from households, hands beaten until they were more map than flesh. She felt the walls of the estate close like a fist. "I will not see you harmed for me," she said, voice small with indignation. Duty came back in jagged little teeth. "I will tell them the truth. I will tell my father." Dante's face shifted. It was a look she had come to know as part of his interior geography, a place carved by experience, fierce pragmatism. "If you tell the Colonel the truth," he said, "he may choose to keep order by making an example. He may decide to sell me further than I can ever come back from. He may choose punishment that is not easily undone. Think, Isabella. Pride is a fine thing until it is a sentence." The choice he asked her to weigh was ugly and terrible, and entirely modern in its cruelty. A woman with everything to lose could pay for the life of a man who had little to bargain with. The ledger did not use mercy. She closed her eyes, the cinder of old certainties snapping under her lids. "What would you have me do?" she asked. Dante's mouth was a hard line. "Wait," he said. "Let me settle you among the house. Let me say I found you. Let me bear what I must in front of your father as the price of keeping you safe. When the morning comes, I will think of a plan. There are ways a man like me can gather coin. If one has permission to work in the town, we can send, buy time. It will be hard. There are risks. But if I can leave for 2 years of labor, buy my freedom, buy land, then I can return and ask, in a way the ledger might accept." The notion of a man like Dante buying his freedom seemed both brash and carved from impossible hope. Freedom could not be purchased in a corner of this world without a host of permissions, but the practicalness in Dante's voice made it sound less like fantasy and more like a work plan scribbled in margins. "Dante," she said, "because a woman's life is given to larger navigations than any single night's terror. You cannot suppose my father will—" Dante shook his head. "I know. I only ask for a promise," he said, "that if I leave, if I go and try, if I do not ask boldly and if I do not return, you will not marry out of duty to the ledger. Wait for me." The request was a small mercy and a great demand. It asked that she surrender the house's neat trajectories and wait as if the motion of her waiting would mean anything in the ledger's cruel mathematics. It asked trust of a man she had, until the night, never seen in such a human light. 2 years, she said, because 2 years mapped itself onto her mind in slow, measured footsteps. It was the length of a season that could teach patience. Promise me you will return. He put his forehead to hers then, simple and direct, a small covenant in the damp air. I promise, he said. If God, and whatever ledger there is, allows, I will return in 2 years and ask for your hand properly, before men who will speak of contracts, not whispers. It was a promise that belonged to men who set their teeth and made plans in the face of storms. It was also a gambit, with a brittle chance of success. But in the small, shrunken hours of that night, when 2 bodies were warmed by a shared fire and the rain outside kept counting, the promise felt like a rope thrown to both of them. They slept in fits and starts, the men moving like shadows around them, the tarpaulin above their heads singing to the rhythm of the storm. When at last dawn bleached the world into a grey that was more exhausted than solemn, Isabela felt herself standing at a threshold she had not imagined crossing. Pride had been pried off her like wet plaster, and in its place something raw and stubborn had taken root. They led her back toward the house, with the sensed choreography of everyone trying to tread a path between truth and survival. News travelled with cruel efficiency on the plantation. The house staff formed a receiving line whose eyes were sharp with calculation. Colonel Augusto Vasconcelos waited on the veranda like a man cast in bronze, his face carved in the maintenance of command. He looked like a man whose ledger was a Bible and whose attention was a sentence. When Dante and the group arrived, the hush around the manor did not feel like relief. It felt like a trap being set in real time. The workers arranged themselves with practiced deference. Dante walked with a measured gait that had a long history of obedience. Isabela could see the colonel's face as he came down the steps. First, a calculation of the physical facts. A mistress returned wet, a fall, a lip split. Then, a gradual tightening around the eyes that betrayed something else. His sense of the house's honor, as if it were a garment he wore and polished. The colonel was a man of codes. Before mercy, there were traditions to be observed. Explain, he said, the single word carrying the tilt of a gavel. Dante's answer was a studied set of truths. He spoke in the tone of a man used to making facts palatable to the ledger. They had found her near the ravine. They had warmed her. She had been resuscitated by the fire. He kept the focus on the practical and the honorable, what would be acceptable to a colonel who liked the world to be neat. Isabela stood at the edge of this exchange like a woman watching 2 ships pass too close. Father, she said finally, because the house required acknowledgement as ritual, I was riding. I fell. Dante found me. He saved my life. Colonel Augusto's face was a map of quiet fury. His lips tightened into a thin line. The color drained a little from his features, as if the night had stolen a stain of certitude. He moved around them with the slow, deliberate step of a man very accustomed to ensuring things were placed back into their proper slots. His eyes measured Dante like a sample of machinery. While he appreciated utility, he also valued order. You owe me the facts, the colonel said. You will not embroider. Dante responded crisp and bare. I do not embroider. For a moment the world hung by that answer. Colonel Augusto had in him a capacity for inflicting consequences that still made the night heavy. He could make Dante disappear from their lives by the turn of his hand. He could sell him, he could distribute him, he could make an example of him. The ledger, the household, the whole social apparatus would be satisfied by blood or by barter. Isabela watched the brief exchange and felt the ledger's shadow crawl over Dante like a stain. Pride was an instruction the colonel knew how to obey with the gloved hand of tradition. She realized, with a new and sharp perception, that her standing beneath those gloves was fragile. Very well, the colonel said at last, and his voice was the voice of a man deciding. There will be an account to be kept. Dante, you will remain under the oversight of the house. Any breach will be punished as the ledger requires. Dante inclined his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The colonel had chosen for him a future that might include the sort of retribution the ledger afforded, but had not yet called for extremity. It was a sentence that meant Dante's life was not immediately forfeit, but it left the threat hanging like a drawn blade. Everyone knew that a man in such a position could be moved from one ledger to another, sold or punished at whim, if rumor needed a backing. Colonel Augusto's final glance at Isabela was the kind of look that encompassed both a father's fury and the calculation of a man who appreciated the maintenance of place. "You will be kept safe," he said to his daughter, the words brittle as a promise made of glass, "and you will remember your obligations." She nodded because the house had conditioned her to acknowledge the obligations without naming all of them. In the quiet of the veranda, with the storm retreating into exhausted clouds, the world looked ordered again on the surface, but the ledger had been disturbed. Later, when the household resumed its accustomed motions and Isabela slept in her room with the faint ache of the earlier night in her bones, Dante stood in the yard with the workers and looked at the house as if it were a shore he had once hoped to cross but could not yet reach. His status was the brittle thing between them. In its shadow, the promise they had made in the cold hours felt both sacred and absurd. He had promised to leave if given the chance to aggregate coin and secure a future. The thought of asking the colonel's permission to hire out, to travel and take risks and to buy his freedom was audacious. It would require a tolerance in the colonel that only affection or calculation might buy. Dante's hands clenched into fists at the thought of asking. He was a man who knew how to turn soil into yield, how to make a worn tool sing again, and he believed in the possibility of labor as a transformer of fate. But he also knew how the ledger could be vindictive. The first part of the plan, a plan sketched on the fly and in the frayed ink of possibilities, was this. He would remain at the plantation for a while and let the rumors settle. He would take odd jobs the colonel permitted, work as always, save any coin he could wring from the edges of the estate, and perhaps seek permission to be hired out to townsmen who might let him earn more than the plantation allowed. He would not steal, he would not run. He would ask for time and for the colonel's understanding, and he would hope the ledger bent. What the plan did not account for was human stubbornness, the colonel's honor, the household's appetite for scandal, Isabela's own swelling need for a life that the house had never given her. As the morning climbed and the air cleared to reveal the plantation in its habitual geometry, sugarcane like a cropped sea, workers already at their stations, the seed of future trouble settled. Dante watched Isabela from the periphery, with a look that was more caution than longing. There was an ache in his chest he did not translate into words. It showed in the way his shoulders hunched sometimes, as if to carry the weight of a world that had never been built for him. He would do what he had to do, he promised himself that. He did not yet know whether the ledger would be merciful. He did not yet know if the colonel would sniff rumor with a hawk's patience and then strike to uphold the house's order. He only knew that he had given a promise to a woman of a house he served, and that in giving it, he had also made a choice that would either damn him or redeem him in ways neither of them fully understood. The day emptied into the work of rebuilding, mending a fence, feeding the horses, patching leather bitten by the rain. Conversations moved in narrow pools. Isabela found herself watched not with the solicitous pity she might have expected, but with the keen interest of people who liked stories that confirmed already drawn conclusions. The workers avoided overt speech, as if the ledger's eyes were everywhere. That night, as the shadows lengthened and the house resumed its rituals, Isabela stood looking out at the Serra. The storm had passed but had left the land washed and bright, as if some purity now separated the world into before and after. She remembered Dante's hand, the feel of his palm against her knuckles, the steadiness in the small hours. She thought of the promise, of 2 years marked like a vow. Inside, the colonel sat with his ledger and petitioned no one as he weighed what action might best preserve the house. Outside, in the quarter where men slept on narrow cots and told jokes stitched with sadness, Dante rolled over and thought of the long path ahead. He inspected the small coins he had, scarce and stubborn, and worked the calculus of wages. He knew the road would be hard, and that the ledger would not be an easy partner. In the house, Isabela dressed in clothes that were more careful now, as if to armor herself against a glare she could not yet name. Pride had been pared back. It had left a rawness that could be transformed into something else, if one were brave enough to let it. She had no illusions that love was enough to disarm a ledger, but she had suddenly a certainty that she would wait for a man she had once known only by the silhouette of labor. The waiting was a small rebellion. The night closed on the plantation like the lid of a book, full of unfinished chapters. In the dark, a number of futures rose and then sank like fish. Each future required sacrifice. Each required a ledger to be negotiated with or defied. They had the promise, the slender rope thrown in the storm, and already other hands had begun to pull. Dawn unstitched itself into a pale, reluctant ribbon across the fields, and with it came the practical motions of consequence. Isabela moved through that morning as if wearing someone else's skin, the same hands, the same dressmaker's fit, but a different interior geography. She kept her face composed because the house demanded it, because men who counted deeds and ledgers read any sign like a ledger line. Yet inside, something raw and private had been loosed. Days gathered into a pattern the way rain collects into rivulets. The house resumed its rituals, meals at appointed times, visitors interviewed on the veranda, the colonel's ledger kept in a careful, dispassionate hand. Gossip, however, is a crop easily coaxed in fertile rumor, and the story of the mistress saved by a man who belonged on paper to another life made for a heavy yield. Servants watched one another with eyes that hid calculations. Visitors tightened their gloves, as if to protect a truth that might stain. Dante worked as he always had, but everything he touched now carried a weight the soil could not lift. He moved like a man with a price on his head, careful not to give the colonel a reason to rearrange the ledger. Yet caution was also a kind of self-bondage. He found himself planning in small increments, where to ask, what to save, who in the town might allow him a little extra work for a little extra coin. Isabela watched him from rooms that were always too warm and too well lit. She learned the economy of silence, not to speak the words that might make her father angrier, not to write the letters that might more directly stake her heart. But she could not entirely be a spectator. In private, she began to learn the forms of quiet resistance that suited her standing. She leveled her features at suitors with the icy politeness of a woman who had rehearsed her refusal. When men came to court her with polite phrases, landed cousins with correct accents and tidy fortunes, her answer was a measured, implacable no. Each refusal was a tiny act of fidelity, a brick placed in the path she had vowed to keep. Letters, when they came, were thin as confessions, and folded with an intimacy that made the thin paper tremble. They arrived by hands that did not ask questions. A young ploughman who owed Dante a favor carried words tucked into a boot and learned to duck his eyes when the mistress smiled. Isabela kept those letters beneath a loose board in her room, reading them at night with the small, fierce concentration of someone who had been taught to value discretion above all else. In Dante's lines there were no flamboyant promises, only accounts of work, the weather of the town, the small violences of a world in which skill could be noticed and yet remain a thing to be bought and traded. He wrote of saving. He wrote of hiring out for days at the tannery, of mending a wagon that had earned him a few extra coins, of being careful where he placed his trust. Each sentence tightened the rope that bound them across distance. Dante's 2-year plan was not a romantic itinerary, but a ledger of labor. He petitioned the colonel in a way that was at once humble and hard-edged, sketching the arithmetic of earnings and the aim of purchase. At first, the colonel sneered at the audacity of a person of Dante's condition asking for time to be hired out. That sort of latitude was often reserved for those with favors to call in. Yet the colonel was a man who respected utility, and he measured Dante's worth in horseflesh and millwork, in the kind of quiet competence that dries a wet field. After a long, shrewd look, the colonel set conditions. Dante could be hired out for 2 seasons, his wages to be split as the colonel saw fit, and he would remain under the estate's ownership until the ledger was paid in full. The colonel's compromise carried the tang of calculation more than mercy. He would not grant freedom without recompense, but he would not throw away a useful asset either. Permission did not mean ease. In town, Dante met a prejudice that was more structural than personal. He had to bargain for work that matched his skill and withstand the little cruelties of men who saw him as both capable and dispensable. He mended carts in the heat, grafted new tongues to older tools, and took on odd jobs at night, his hands closing around coin like a man who had learned to love small things fiercely because they were scarce. He made friends where he could, an older shoemaker who admired his steadiness, and an innkeeper who understood the utility of having someone who could repair a wheel on a night when a judge's carriage might be stalled. Those men nodded and paid him what they could, or allowed him to sleep in humble shelter when rain threatened. There were nights Dante returned with aching shoulders and a pocket that barely shifted its weight. There were afternoons when the thought of being returned to the plantation with newfound funds seemed like a fantasy both precious and absurd. He kept accounts in his head the way his hands kept time with a plough. He bought small things with great caution, a length of cloth for a shirt that would last, an iron kettle that would not rust. Once he gave a coin to a child who had followed him with a serious look and a pair of eyes like a mirror. The child's thanks scraped at something in him that had not been allowed the language of gratitude beyond labor. Meanwhile, Isabella's life assumed a different sort of discipline. She took it upon herself to learn the ledger's crust, books of account, the ordering of house staff, the schedule of visitors, as if mastering the colonel's instruments might give her leverage to speak where emotional arguments were dismissed. She read the ledgers with a new, practical interest. She learned how much a man's freedom might cost in that economy, how many years of labor a small plot of land could buy. In society salons she listened to the talk of dowries and titles and turned the conversation away from frivels toward the arithmetic of estate management, an odd subterfuge that made gossipers label her as now practical. The label suited her fine. Rumor did all its economic work. A neighboring planter hinted that Dante's presence at the house had been a nearly intolerable breach. Women walked a little straighter and spoke a little softer. Men slowed their steps when Dante passed within earshot. The colonel, always opportunistic, watched to see whether the rumor would demand a demonstration of resolve. For weeks, that demonstration did not come. Then, in the second season, a man arrived at the plantation whose interest unsettled the fragile order. A transporter from a distant estate had come seeking strong hands. He inquired about a purchase for a man known for being skillful. The transporter was blunt and cold, his eyes calculating the cost and the risk. The colonel, in a rare and uncomfortable meeting, listened. It was the sort of transaction Dante feared. A sale to a place distant enough to make any bargain of reunion nearly impossible. The colonel's face betrayed nothing, but his fingers tapped the ledger as though weighing possibilities. For a night, the whole household breathed on a different axis. One half held the possibility that Dante could be moved and never seen again. The other half prepared for the steps that would follow if the colonel chose profit over the whisper of mercy. Dante heard of the visit through the grapevine of workers and came to the colonel's office with the bluntness of a man who had rehearsed restraint until it was almost an art. He asked for leave, again, this time with urgency. He offered a plan that read less like supplication and more like the logic of a worker who knew his numbers. Let me be hired to the town longer, press me where coin is more likely to be paid, and a portion of what I make will go directly into the payment that would clear my name from the ledger. If you sell me now, you make profit. If you allow me to buy myself, you make greater gain later and preserve the house's reputation of being a place that values industrious men. The colonel, who liked a profit and an arrangement that kept things neat, considered the proposition. Isabella learned of the danger through a note slipped under her door, the handwriting tense and fierce. Transporter inquired, Colonel fastidious. She did not tell the house she was worried, because worry is a contagion in manor walls. Instead, she arranged herself for action. She approached her father, the only time she did so in full, unmediated force, and spoke plainly. Her voice was low but impossible to ignore. "Do not sell him," she said. "If you must move him, make it for a price that allows him purchase. Do not send him elsewhere as if he were cattle. I know how you measure the world, father. Measure now what his life is worth to him." Colonel Augusto listened as if passing a new ledger. He had in him the ancestor of certain mercies. He was capable of calculation that included sentiment when it also included sense. The man had no illusions about sentiment as a ledger line to be balanced, yet he also prized the house's ability to appear as both stern and fair. In the end, he agreed to a compromise. Dante could be hired out to the town longer, and the colonel would accept a share of his wages in the interim. It was neither generous nor cruel. It was pragmatic. Dante's fate was postponed by transaction. The 2-year clock slid forward with the stubborn regularity of seasons. Letters between Isabela and Dante, once furtive, acquired a cadence. They rarely spoke of passion. Rather, they kept track of the small, life-sustaining measures of their days. How much Dante saved, the names of the people who had shown him kindness. The suitors Isabela had turned aside. Their correspondences matured into a life ledger of promises and accounts. Dante kept his vow with the skill of a man who had learned to turn scarcity into purpose. He worked among men who spoke little and judged less, turning planks and wheels into the little wealth he needed. He earned more than he had now and then, and there were setbacks. An employer who cheated, a brawl that left him bloody for a week, and with a weaker purse, an illness that ate several days of labor. Each setback meant nights when the thought of giving up and fleeing to some far surer haven whispered to him. But each time he thought of the damp night on the ridge, and of Isabela's face pressed against his chest, and of the promise he had given with his forehead to hers. He tightened his belt and kept going. Isabela, for her part, fashioned endurance into an art. In the house she assumed more responsibility, and she did so not to win praise, but to create an economy of integrity she could live with. She supervised supplies with a keen eye, learned the small arithmetic of household expenses, and even worked quietly to send little help to Dante through intermediaries, a length of cloth that meant less was spent on clothes, a few coins slipped into a seam on a workman's shirt. She refused to accept any suitor's gift, where the giver assumed that marriage was a right purchase by money alone. Their conversations, when they met in letters, were threads of mutual fortitude, less confessional than contractual, in a way that suited the time and their stakes. There were days when her resolve faltered. A visiting cousin joked of prudence as a virtue, and implied marriage would not wait forever for personal sentiment. Another time, the colonel's friends suggested matches that would strengthen the house's coffers. Each suggestion took an edge off her patience, and sometimes late at night she allowed herself the luxury of grief, mourning not just for what might not be, but for how small gestures of love could be so easily priced by custom and by men who counted names in ledgers. As the months accumulated, Dante found unexpected allies. The shoemaker who had once let him sleep in a corner of his shop took a more active interest, teaching Dante the finer points of bookkeeping and pointing out opportunities in the town's marketplace. Through a chain of small fortunes, jobs mended, a horse shod for a sympathetic merchant, coins saved in a hidey hole, Dante began to accumulate enough to make offers. He spoke in precise terms of buying a small parcel of land on the far side of the river, a plot that would not make him wealthy, but would give him the legal foundation to be reckoned with. The idea of land, of having an address not scourged by a colonel's signature, felt to him like a kind of baptism. At one point the colonel, perhaps in a mood of practical vanity as much as fairness, called Dante to the house and tested the man before Isabela. He asked for an account of his earnings, for a verifiable plan for the purchase, and, most dangerously, he spoke openly about expectations in terms that made the ledger's teeth show. Dante answered with a simplicity that both flattered and frustrated the colonel. He presented what was in his pockets and what he intended to do with it. His language was plain, his numbers sober, his gaze steady. The colonel, who liked to see things settled and numbers in their place, recognized a sort of integrity that calmed him. It was not love that made him agree later to the formalization of Dante's plan. It was the quiet satisfaction of a man who liked, when accounts balanced without theatrics. When the 2-year mark approached, the air of expectation around the house doubled. Workers and house staff watched one another with soft, conspiratorial eyes. Isabela walked the rooms like someone rehearsing a role she had long ago dismantled and rebuilt on her own terms. She refused suitors with the same steady force as before. She gave no welcome to the idea of someone else stepping into the place Dante might fill. Her father watched this transformation with a complex attention, sometimes puzzled, sometimes disapproving, sometimes oddly proud. He had never seen his daughter so disciplined in conviction. Dante's final month of labor was wrapped in a tactile anxiety, accounts settled, payments demanded, an anxious negotiation with the seller of the parcel. There were petty snares, men who attempted to undercut him for the parcel, a miscount in the ledger, that required him to take on extra work binding timber, and a nearly catastrophic moment when misunderstandings in the town nearly cost him the sale. He slept little. He bit bread without relish. He kept the old shoemaker's small notebook chained to him like a relic. When at last he returned to the plantation, it was with the look of a man who had been refashioned by years of small negotiations. He carried a folded paper, the deed to a small plot of land on the far bank of the river, its name stamped and the price paid in coins that had been gathered with a stubborn pride. There was a certificate, too, a sort of arrangement acknowledged in town records, that showed the colonel had accepted a sum toward Dante's formal manumission. The colonel had not simply waved away the ledger, rather he had accepted the arithmetic, a bargain that suited the house's sense of order and its pocket. Isabela waited at the verge of the cane for his arrival, every muscle tuned to the moment of recognition. When Dante stepped from the cart, there was a shift in him, shoulders squared differently, the set of a jaw that had been hardened into a promise. He bore no showy sign of triumph. His clothes were modest, his hands still the hands that had worked, but in his pocket the coins had been turned into something more than metal. They had been fenced into law. The colonel met him with a face that had learned to measure merit and risk alike. For a time he scrutinized the papers, as if the ink might dissolve, as if the numbers might be a trick. Then something in his expression gave way to the slow acceptation of a man who, when confronted with solid proof, could yield some measure of approval. He held Dante's gaze not as a superior, nor as an owner, but as a man who had made a calculation and had found profit in honor. "So you have kept your side of the account," the colonel said finally. The words were not warm, they were a ledger balanced, yet in their coldness lay a grudging respect. "You may present your request." Dante stepped forward, his voice precise, the old roughness tempered by the calm of a man who had learned to argue in numbers. He asked, formally, plainly, for Isabela's hand. He showed the deed, the town's papers, and the outline of how he planned to support a household. He spoke not in extravagant sentiment, but in terms that a colonel would respect. Contracts, a parcel of land, an ability to pay debts. There was a hush. Isabela felt her heart press against her ribs like an animal in a tight cage. She had rehearsed the moment not with fantasy, but with a practical gravity. Her acceptance of Dante was not a theatrical line. It had been the result of 2 years of deliberate withholding and courageous small acts. Colonel Augusto, who had the tastes of a man schooled in ceremony, did not offer a loud blessing. He did not kneel to sentiment, but he performed his instrument. He spoke the words the world required. "You have made yourself into something she may accept," he said to Dante. The words were a seal as much as a permission. For Isabela they sounded like atonement. There was opposition, of course. A few relatives whispered that the match would blight the family name. They suggested there were more convenient alliances to be made. Yet the colonel, who had a taste for order and profit alike, enjoyed the finality of a solution that cost him nothing and earned him the appearance of decency. He pronounced with the gravity of a man who liked a well-tallied account that if Dante desired the house's blessing, he would have it, provided the binding was lawful, the papers in order, and the promise to maintain the estate's dignity kept. Isabela did not swoon in public. She sat with the quiet composure of someone who had learned how to make a life by dint of resolve. The wedding that followed was modest, neither the full pomp of the colonel's more expensive matches nor the crude quickness of a clandestine union. It was held in the small parish church, where the light fell through glass, softened with age. Workers and townsfolk sat together in a rare, uneasy harmony. The house's guests were present, with their noses faintly wrinkled at a match they had not expected. The colonel gave his word, formal and brittle, and Dante accepted as a man who had achieved more than a romantic notion. He had made himself an accountable partner. Isabela and Dante married with the kind of solemnity born of weathered promises. There were glances exchanged that spoke of a different history than the house had catalogued. They glided around one another like two people who had mapped and remapped a territory and now found it habitable. Their union did not erase the ledger's memory. It simply placed a new account within it. Years passed. The estate carried on, seasons changed, and the cane grew tall again. Dante turned his parcel into a modest homestead, a place where the earth accepted seed and returned it with a blunt generosity. He and Isabela learned to weave their daily life with work and quiet, with the sound of a child's foot, sometimes echoing in the yard, where once there had been only the measured steps of servants. They did not pretend the world had changed wholesale. Prejudice remained a dull undercurrent, and the colonel's ledger had left its mark on the house and on many who served it. Yet within the small geography of their home, something permanent had taken root, an ordinary warmth born of shared labor, and the discipline of promises fulfilled. There were times when dread rose, an anonymous note scrawled with venom, an old acquaintance's whisper, a sudden eye that seemed to measure possibilities for profit, but the pattern they had built proved resilient. They raised their children on a mixture of strictness and affection, teaching them the dignity of work and the necessity of keeping one's word. Dante taught his son how to mend a wheel. Isabela taught her daughter the stubbornness of refusing what is offered without heart. They honored the hard lesson that love, when it survives, is as much a succession of small choices as it is a single grand gesture. Colonel Augusto grew older and withered in the way that men who have loved order do. He visited their house sometimes with a surprising gentleness that he did not know how to name. When he looked at Dante, the man he once thought of as merely utilitarian, there were flashes of a different calculation, of a man who had kept his promises, who had met the colonel's demands with industriousness rather than rebellion. It was a reconciliation made in the terms the colonel cherished, respectability. He listened now when Dante spoke of plans. He permitted small investments to be made when asked. He spoke occasionally of pride, but without the old sharpness. On a night like the one that had begun it all, when thunder gathered and the Serra appeared to knock at the house's door, Dante and Isabela sat by their own hearth, older in the way that the years will teach a person to be fewer illusions and more intentional love. Rain tapped at the panes. The room smelled of stew and a child's patched blanket. Isabela's hand found Dante's across the table with the casual certainty of long acquaintance. They did not need to speak the word that had once saved them. The memory carried it like a pulse. In the dim light, Isabela remembered the cold with a clarity that was almost a visible thing. The weight of wet silk, the flare of lightning, the command that had been both a medical imperative and a pivot. She smiled, not at the ledger or at the colonel, but at the stubbornness of life. Dante's fingers closed over hers, rough and familiar, and he looked at her with the steadiness of a man who had kept his promise. "Remember that night?" he asked, the question folded like an old map. She nodded. Her eyes were soft with years, and with the memory of the smallness of the human body faced with its fragility. "You told me to take off my wet dress," she said, and the sentence was light, but held its old force. It was nothing like the world's scandalous retellings. It was a fact of survival made whole by what came after. He smiled then, a slow, private thing. "And you obeyed," he said. "It was the decision that changed everything," she answered. Not with anger, but with an awareness that the choice had been terrible and sacred all at once. The choice had been born of survival and had grown through labor into a future neither had the right to promise without payment. They both knew the cost of their life, the years of discipline, the humiliation the house had required, the subtle compromises that had to be reconciled with honesty. Outside, thunder rolled, as if the world still needed to keep its accounts with the weather. Inside, a warm light made the room small and human, the children's laughter muffled from the next room. The house, with its histories and its ledgers, held them in one of its many possible arrangements. Isabela leaned back and let the night claim its old, familiar shape. 2 years, she mused. A short time, a long time. For some, a lifetime, Dante said. They did not need to say more. The rain that night fell with a gentleness that felt less like punishment and more like benediction. Isabela pressed closer to Dante and his hand, and the two of them sat in the quiet of a life purchased with work and guarded by promises. The ledger had not been erased, but they had written a new line upon it, one that read of labor transformed into freedom, of a pledge kept across seasons, of a woman who had chosen to trust a man who, by force of will and moral patience, had built himself into a husband. If you would like the full written short story, the original version is in the description. Read it there and find more storm-born tales like this one.